If there was a space or a question involved anywhere in that introduction, you can check with him for details where we exchanged. I like this place for three reasons, namely your congregation. Number one, Gary McCary comes close to holding the record for how long a congregation can put up with a pastor. You can't be all bad down here. Number two, let me grope for number two. One moment, please. I'm older than I used to be. It'll come. We eschewed politics and refrained from voting until John F. Kennedy ran for the presidency. As with the Brady Bunch, Sabbath school pictures of heavenly beings tended to sport trimmed blonde hair, and these teaching aids went well beyond the Brady Bunch scenes. Loma Linda's Hill Beautiful, crowned by the Victorian Old San structure, gave way to New Jerusalem's golden glow. My Shetland ponies were surpassed vastly by visions of lions and lambs frolicking together. Orange grove trees were distinctly trumped by the bountiful tree of life that bore all kinds of fruits. And the Gage Canal, where we often swam, was nothing compared to the shimmering waters of the river of life. I might parenthetically note that one graphic depiction of eternity did puzzle this seventh grader. The glorious New Jerusalem set high on a hill was reached only by steps. Scores, if not hundreds of steps. But these creatures treading the immaculate edge sidewalks below, I wondered about things dying in heaven like grass that you trimmed from the sidewalks. These beings were equipped with wings. Conundrum. If in heaven we are equipped with wings, what's the function of steps? Of course, this elementary school student would later come to discover that the cosmic metaphors depicting eternity call us to a future far beyond that which affects our vast and best hopes. A beyond that no one can claim to fully understand, comprehend, and a beyond that ever lies beyond us. For Amos, the farmer, vintner, herdsman, trimmer of sycamore trees, the new earth is a vast ranch, boasting fertile lands, bountiful vineyards, abundant orchards, and green pastures. For John, awed by the city of Rome, eternity is envisioned as an even greater city, the New Jerusalem. For my paternal grandfather, whose face evidenced sad resignation as we sat together at the hayloft door in 1943 and watched implements and stock of his Nebraska farm being auctioned off due to having suffered a severe heart attack. I have a hunch amounting to a certainty that his vision of heaven varied between Amos's farm, but in fact was a fertile and verdant Nebraska farm, and in a context where heart attacks are no more. Sitting in that hayloft door with grandfather, a seed was planted that would later call me to understand that the metaphors of heaven are calls to hope. Hope is a spiritual necessity. Without hope, the spark of life fades and sputters out. Hope is a sociological necessity. Without hope, there can be no meaningful social reform. Hope inspires Hebrew prophets to shout, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Hope inspires these same rugged individuals to assert, "Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." Hope inspires the prophet from Montgomery to cite, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In spite of severe prophetic woes, I come to discover these prophets are by definition optimists who call us to hope. By my senior year at Loma Linda Academy, I'd pretty much tuned out on stories of Adventist mission. I reacted negatively to the term heathens. I was bothered by what appeared to be a lack of cultural sensitivity. I was troubled by the triumphalism of those proclaiming, "We have the truth." I found the term God's remnant often to be employed triumphantly rather than humbly. Plus, these stories were so much alike, and always with an offering at the end. I do remain eternally grateful for the personal ethics code that I inherited in the town of my youth. To be courteous and obedient, to keep the level eye, to go on God's errands, to walk softly in the sanctuary, to keep a song in my heart, and I was also never taught to say the N-word. Yet as the early 50s merged into the mid-50s, my high school years, the personal ethics prohibition against employing the racist N-word was radically compounded by burgeoning social ethics imperatives. A new social fabric was being woven in our nation as separate but equal and Jim Crow practice and Klan violence came to be challenged by preachers, poets, prophets, protesters, politicians, and populists alike. The unanimous Supreme Court judgment, Brown versus Board of Education, there's an esteemed black Adventist pastor and daughter in the story here, struck down the ruling of separate but equal, which had, of course, been experienced decisively as separate and unequal. Our nation was called to face down laws, institutions, folkways, mores, patterns, existing and doing and becoming contemporary. Our nation was called to face down these laws, institutions, etc. Contemporary prophets echoed the words of ancient Hebrew seers in calling institutions no less than individuals to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly. The general populace came to recognize that our segregated society was maintained not only by personal racism embedded in individual hearts, but by institutional racism, structural racism, maintained by these structures in need of challenge and change. Presidents of our land stepped in to foster justice, social ethics, social change. Dwight David Eisenhower ordered troops to patrol the integration of Little Rock. And there's an Adventist student among those Little Rock 9. John F. Kennedy called for a nation with structures that would be built on inclusiveness. Lyndon Johnson, prodded by Martin Luther King, for those especially who have seen the film Selma, "We Shall Overcome" was sung as he led Congress in lobbying for the Civil Rights Act. Stories of heroes and sheroes inspired us. The Little Rock 9, Rosa Parks, Reverend James Reeb, freedom rider from Boston, where Jesus will return, was beaten to death in Selma. 3 Chicago boys, Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney. I've stood at the site of their murder and burial. 4 little black Baptist girls bombed to death in Birmingham while dressed in their Sunday best. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" echoing across the tide pool. What's wrong with this picture? Problem. As our national consciousness moved beyond the personal ethics pledge of not saying the N-word to embrace the social ethics imperatives on fostering equality, no one in my hometown uttered a single phrase in my hearing that reflected on how a personal ethic of not saying the N-word can now translate into a social ethic that calls for institutional change in these transitory times. No Pathfinder leader, no elementary school teacher, no academy teacher, no Sabbath school teacher, no community pastor. Just as our 19th century founders surely must have embraced the personal ethics code of not saying the N-word, their social ethics code clearly and distinctly called for demanding the ending of slavery through a change in structural reforms. Ellen White labeled slavery a sin of the darkest dye and called for civil disobedience of the congressionally enacted Fugitive Slave Act that required escaped slaves to the North to be returned to their pastors. Joseph Bates founded an abolitionist society in his hometown. John Harvey Kellogg maintained a station on the Underground Railroad. James White, Uriah Smith, J.N. Andrews penned hard-hitting Review and Herald editorials opposing slavery. Sadly, the mid-20th century descendants of these hallowed pioneers in our hometown fell far short of living up to the expectations embodied in the titles of our key periodicals and failed to live up to the models of behavior established by our hallowed 19th century leaders. They did not read the signs of the times. They were not living in these times. They eschewed present truth. Rhetorical question. Is our shared story of Adventist mission intended only to foster good people with a strong personal ethic? Or does our shared story also call us to support the creation of good, righteous social institutions in church and society that reflect strong ethics that promote social justice? By way of passing on stories to religious communities in mission. I don't like this reading, but unless I read, it doesn't correspond with slides. And this is the only presentation I've ever done tied down here to slides. My noble assistant at the Stall Center said, "No, they aren't looking at you. They're looking at the slides." I hope that's true because I feel I'm corralled up here. The stories we pass on and how we tell them give shape to the community of faith that our children and our children's children inherit or reject. Our version of Adventist mission is shaped by the stories that we include, that we edit, or that we simply omit and fail to pass on to our children. In his University of Chicago Divinity School dissertation, later published under the title Discovering an Evangelical Heritage, Donald Dayton notes the frustration that he experienced as a student at an evangelical New England campus in the 1960s. The campus was high on rigidly enforcing personal ethics stipulations: no movies, no card playing, no inclusion in the yearbook photos of males on the swim team with exposed torsos, while big world items was involved in social ethics, concerns such as race, as war, as women's rights. Dayton was forced to query, as indeed some of us have, as well as some of our children, are we forced to choose between being religious and being relevant to the times? Yet, in subsequently mining his Wesleyan Methodist evangelical roots, Dayton became at once puzzled and overjoyed. He discovered that a full century earlier, his religious forebears were up to their steeples in such social ethics and social justice issues as the abolition movement, the Underground Railroad, women's rights, and called for economic reforms. But more, Dayton documents how such accounts of his heritage missed being passed on to his children by documenting the manner in which progressive social ethics planks and resolutions voted in his official church assemblies simply came to be shelved. And in some cases, as history was written, it was rewritten and omitted some of the activism of his Wesleyan Methodist religious roots. One rather humorous factoid on Adventist overt editing out of history. A formal photograph of Ellen White and family in the archives of the White Estate and at La Sierra University has Ellen flanked with necklace-wearing female family members with strings of beads contrasting sharply with their attire. But the photo, when published by the Review and Herald, airbrushed out the offending jewelry. A less humorous factoid in the reviewing of Adventism's treatment of social ethics issues is evidenced by a review of how the denomination's, quote, official church paper has treated prevailing social issues. The degree to which Adventism's story has become domesticated at the expense of a commitment to social ethics and social transformation is seen in a content analysis of articles covering the issues of social justice and the issue of war. Two leading social issues during the 1860s to 1865, you all know. All of your children's children as sophomores do not necessarily know. Race, war. 1850s, 1860 to 1865 particularly. Race and war. Two leading social issues during the 1960s were race and war. These parallel epochs are characterized by Robert Bellah, leading sociologist of religion in Berkeley, now retired, as our third times of national trial. The first such designated epoch being the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and a Review and Herald analysis in the 1860 to 1865 showed that well over 100 articles were included facing the two predominant social issues of race and war. Over 100 articles in 5 years. Whereas in the 1960s, less than half a dozen articles addressed the pressing two social issues of the time, race and war. And this included in this paltry total was not the strident, aggressive, partisan tone of the editor, but in the 1960s, hesitation, and in one occasion when Roy Branson's article was published featuring the activism of the 1860s, a full editorial plus a lead line under his name said, a plea for objectivity. Essentially, don't cancel your subscription just because we're being relevant now and talking about two social issues. Hello, friends. Now, we're skipping some so that we don't keep you overtime. We're skipping looking at key biblical themes. I'm going to go into one New Testament theme and mention a couple in 2 sentences. I must say that I owe a relook at Matthew 24 and 25 to my time at Andrews University in the Adventist Theological Seminary. To be honest, however, I do need to state the fact that this particular professor was from the School of Education and not from the seminary. In Matthew 4 and 25, all red ink, starting at verse 3, Jesus is dealing with his disciples, and the question, as you all know, that they ask him, when will the kingdom come? A question Jesus doesn't answer. They do convolute into their question, when shall these things be? Parentheses. There's no proof that Matthew 24 immediately follows Matthew 23. But it is interesting to note in the way that Matthew edits things, lo and behold, he never explodes more vehemently, is that a word? Vehemently, against the religious leaders of the time than in Matthew 23. And so involved in Jesus is giving hell to the scribes and Pharisees that he's crying at the end as he looks at Jerusalem and weeps over a structure, an institution that has so far left the kingdom covenant calls of the prophets. So he's crying. Now, we don't know that Matthew 24 comes, but what it has is, now Jesus is walking with his disciples in front of the buildings, and something, the temple, and something that leads me to think it may have followed. The disciples ask a dumb question. I have had to tell widows that didn't know they were widows through a street light reflecting off of a screened door. And when I had to announce this through a screen door, she of course let me in. She was a little strange. She didn't normally let anybody inside her house. And we sat down, and I had to tell her husband died. She immediately called 2 daughters. The first daughter knew how to live with silence. The daughter, myself, mother sat together. Then came the second daughter. Talk, 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 talk. Well, if Jesus and his disciples are walking past the temple buildings, and Matthew 24 does follow Matthew 23, they probably didn't want to interrupt the silent reflection. But then those who can't live with silent reflection need to talk, 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 talk. And what do they have Peter saying? It wasn't Peter, and it's not recorded. See these nice buildings? They've been walking by those buildings 3 times a day for years, okay? When shall these things be? What will be the signs of your coming in the end of the world? And scholars suggest that Jesus knows they're confused, and he gives some signs. But they walk in silence. And the disciples are eager to know eschatology. Give us a chart. Tell us when. And Jesus doesn't do it. True or false? Skipping to Matthew 25. 3 parables. Parables of the faithful stewards. No, sorry. First, parables of the bridesmaids. Be prepared. Parable of the stewards. Invest your talents now in the marketplace of life. Parable of the sheep and the goats. Echoing the call of every Old Testament prophet, and if you don't read it, read a short one, Amos. No tact. Create social structures called for by the covenant. And in every Old Testament prophet, the shorthand of the covenant is 4 groups. Is social ethics. Is institutions that call for justice. Yahweh looks to see how you are organizing your society in favor of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. I wrote an article that said hundreds of times, and the editor jumped on me. And you know, editors now have these special mechanics that they can plug in and draw arrows to different parts of your manuscript. Hundreds of times, go count them. I went and counted them. And it is hundreds and hundreds of times. The poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. Create your institutions. Create your covenanted people in ways that, Yahweh says, I don't even have to have my glasses on. I just check out how is your society. Whoops, maybe I can't put these back on again with a microphone. I guess we made it. How are you treating the poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien? See what happens when I go off text and I don't keep moving straight forward? Kingdom of heaven is like leaven. Knead it in. Make justice happen. The stewards, to repeat. Be faithful. Invest in the marketplace of life, preceded by the virgins. Be prepared. And then finally, the sheep and the goats. Hey, make sure that you are leavening your people and taking care of the dispossessed, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien. Now, I threw you all off on the slides at that point. What number are you on now? Okay, we're now, let's move on to 122. And I got to introduce this since we skipped, so be patient with me. My wife and I are tourists at this point in Cusco, Peru. Tourists. We meet a Marinol Catholic priest. Happily, he was a graduate of Berkeley in the sociology of religion. I was a graduate with degrees from Boston University and Harvard in sociology of religion. I didn't know jack about South America, my first trip there. When he heard I was an Adventist, he said, "Oh, then you know the story of Fernando and Anastal." And I mumbled, "I remember a story about the Broken Stone Mission." And that's all I remembered. I'm glad I met him because he changed the direction of my life in many ways, including founding the Stahl Center at La Sierra University, including, this is a pitch. When you've given your children and your children's children all of the artifacts that you've gathered from various parts of the world, remember the Stahl Center and its museum. And I had a third pitch that crept in, but it crept out, and pray that I remember it because I'll make that pitch again. Okay. Okay. By way of retelling our children one story of Adventist mission, we're on slide number 122. Stories of Adventist mission that I rebelled against during my early teenage years included the story of one Fernando and Anastal. The story I remember pictured a courageous man who paid his own way to the Andes Mountains with his wife. This man, if you think I'm being sexist here, I am, preached the remnant message to unlettered native people, warped by Catholicism and other, quote, heathen practices. And he rode a mule named Samson, praised as a creature who surely would be in heaven by Stahl. A village chief begged Stahl to send a teacher to his village, and Stahl gave the chief a broken stone to serve as a chit. The Broken Stone Mission was established as a congregation was organized, and many baptisms resulted. So much for the story I heard in Sabbath school of the 1950s. Fernando Stahl appeared again in my consciousness a second time some 3 days later, decades later. When I met this priest, he said, "Well, if you're an Adventist, you know the story of Fernando and Anastal." My response, "There was an Anastal?" Well, let that sink in. Slide 121. Fernando and Anastal are our spiritual forebears, mentors from whom we have learned much. This is a Catholic Maryknoll priest from God-forsaken Butte, Montana. Anybody here ever been to Butte, Montana? His parents ran the New Deal bar there. They did not drink. They were teetotalers, but they ran the New Deal bar. I'm on slide 128, I think. The Catholic priest. Fernando and Anastal have been our spiritual forebears. The Maryknoll Catholic Order in the Andes. What's wrong with this picture? I was honored to participate in the celebration of his 25th anniversary as a Maryknoll Catholic priest. I could either go to the establishment Maryknoll Order back in New York, or my wife and I could go up to his hometown, and we wanted to see his hometown and did. The gospel that Fernando and Anastal incarnated took place not only in chapels and churches, but in such initiatives as clinics, health education programs, open markets. Their reputation being so widespread that their influence is credited with contributing to the inclusion of a religious toleration clause in Peru's national constitution. shades of impacting social structures. Above all, the priest continued, they risked death at the hands of the powerful 10% whites and mestizos who held 90% of the indigenous population in ignorance and at bay, appropriating the lands, forcing labor, denying due process, and such civil rights as access to lands, education, or the voting booth. Taking the disenfranchised poor, widow, and orphan seriously by facing down structures was the Stall's response. What a great mission story. This mission story did not content itself with Bible studies on doctrine, did not content itself live a healthier life. All good things. But indeed faced down social structures. Against all odds and totally against centuries of established custom and traditions, the Stalls initiated the first coeducational and first indigenous school system. Whites and mestizos who spoke Spanish, 12%, max, most folks say 8%, of the population was the only one that received education in the Peruvian Andes. The 92% Quechua and Aymara people fenced out. The priest concluded with a flourish. We were speaking in Spanish, and such carries a greater punch. In empowering the indigenous peoples, Fernando and Ana Stall were visionaries, missionaries, and revolucionarios. Following on the priest's testimony, I sent away for 36 dissertations from Europe, South America, North America, by academics conducting research on the Lake Titicaca Basin. Imagine my happy surprise in discovering that whether the subject of such research was agronomy or zoology, the Stall's contribution to social change in Peru was documented in formats that range from footnotes to extended full chapters to a Yale University dissertation entitled as follows: The Awakening of Puno. The Lake Titicaca capital, Puno City. The Lake Titicaca state, Puno State. That dissertation, The Awakening of Puno, 1900 to 1950, 2/3 of which was the history of Adventism in the Altiplano. His first appointment upon graduation was Berkeley, UC Berkeley. His second appointment was, and where he still is, Harvard University. 1900 to 1950 dominated by a history of the Adventist Church waking up Puno. Hello, friends. A missionary who prayed with people, who baptized people, who reviewed Bible studies with people, but who with his spouse, no less, is praised and documented and footnoted for instituting social change in the state of Puno. If it sounds like I get carried away, it's because I am. And now I have no clue where I am, but we'll kind of wrap this up. Let's jump down to let's jump down to slide 140. Probably never do it again with slides. I can't be fenced in. Okay, and I'm not proud of that. Let's jump down to 147, okay? By definition, to be a progressive voice during the Stahl years in Peru was to be anti-state church and anti-clerical. Hence, progressives had a field day in depicting their take on the work of church functionaries and the Stahl crowd. Examples of such endorsements include, and this doesn't do justice to them, it's just a quick sketch. Francisco Mostajo, a liberal spokesman from Arequipa, observed that while Puno's priests planned religious fiestas, their Protestant counterparts established clinics and schools for the indigenous peoples, totaling 92% and totally fenced out from education. Mostajo's colleague, Ernesto Reyna, flatly observed that while the Protestant leaders taught and healed, their priestly counterparts sang masses and planned fiestas. Anti-clerical Manuel González Prada, in a rare compliment to organized religion of any stripe, noted that whereas the Jesuits contented themselves with teaching the wealthy elite while enjoying the comforts of Lima, the Adventists braved the rigors of the highlands to teach the disinherited classes. Citations from 3 of many more contemporary sources that document the strong social justice results from the Stahl Adventist presence include doctoral candidate student Dan Hazen, whose initial appointment was University of California at Berkeley, present appointment is Harvard, spent the better part of a year living on the shores of Lake Titicaca producing a dissertation which reeks with social change implications. Quote, "The awakening of Puno, Adventists have been consistently in the forefront of change in the Peruvian highlands." Hello, friends. University of Colorado anthropology student Ted Llewellyn, later professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia, initially advanced the hypothesis that the Aymara indigenous people embraced Adventism to get a leg up financially by learning to speak Spanish. After living on a Lake Titicaca island for the better part of a year in comparing the Adventists and general population, Llewellyn was forced to radically alter his hypothesis. Upon discovering that the closed and barter economy of the early Stahl era offered virtually no opportunity for financial entrepreneurship, he concluded, quote, "Adventism served to select out of the mass of oppressed humans, not because they were motivated financially, that meager group of deviants to whom education and learning had an almost addictive appeal, a group who were not satisfied to be slaves to their mestizo oppressors or to their own ignorance. Here we have a people preparing for an unforeseeable future 50 years before it arrives." Point. They couldn't turn their speaking of Spanish into monetary gain precisely because it was not a monetary economy. It was a land-based economy. However, you bet your sweet bippy, 50 years later, when we now have a monetary economy, of course, those indigenous people who had learned to speak Spanish were miles ahead. I was going to skip the rest, but I'll include Gustavo Gutierrez. Gustavo Gutierrez, father of liberation theology. Planning an educational conference focusing on indigenous education in the Peruvian highlands, I wanted to get Gustavo Gutierrez to present. On the 50th or 25th anniversary of the publication of his book, Liberation Theology, he was honored and did a speech at a international convention where religion teachers go each year. By that time, I'd published a couple of things in a peer-reviewed Spanish journal in Peru. So I waited till he received his applause and then followed him around where he would be going to lunch someplace, and happily he was by himself. So I, not unlike when I followed my wife the first day at New College, wanting to try to eat with her, I stayed a few paces behind and then was ready to move in, and then found out that there was assigned seating. So I had to ask the matron to give me a table with her next time around. I did, and we married. Back to Gustavo Gutierrez. I follow him into this little eatery, stay 3 paces behind him, stay 3 paces in line at the trays, and then I joined him at the table, and I lay down a Peruvian journal that I knew of, that had published the stories of the stalls. And I laid this open. I said, I've been doing work on indigenous education in the Andes, and going to have a conference next summer. Would like you to consider joining us. And he glanced at it. In the Spanish-speaking version, of course, I played up the South American bunch. And he looked at that and he said, I know all these people. And he agreed. Well, here's an excerpt that I pulled from his presentation. In the face of severe injustice, suffering, and oppression, the stalls identified with the poorest of the poor and incarnated the gospel. I see that's slide 143. You're way ahead of me. I like you. Which profoundly impacted the spiritual, social, economic, and political life of the Peruvian highlands. The experience of our friends Fernando and Ana, I love that he called them by their first names. He saw them as fellow travelers, true or false. The experience of our friends Fernando and Ana calls us to live with the tension of enacting, and you folks who speak Spanish know that in Spanish, this carries an italics, an underline, a bold, and an exclamation point of enacting the ja, the now of God's kingdom, while recognizing that the not yet fullness of that kingdom eludes human history. What a great quote to describe the presence of these missioners. We're going to skip slide number 146 as we seek to race toward the end. In fact, maybe let's jump to slide 149 in our last paragraph. The stall story of Adventist mission, recalled from my youth, stressed orthodoxy, right belief, resulting in personal transformation. An adventurous missionary evangelized by riding a mule named Samson and preaching right doctrine to ignorant natives who were subject to the false teachings of Catholicism and other heathens. The story recalled from my youth. Maybe warped. I accept it. The stall story of Adventist mission shared by my priest friend addressed orthodoxis, right belief, as well as orthopraxis, right practice, resulting in a social ethics, social transformation, social justice pursuits. This version of the stall story praised Fernando and Ana Stall for inculcating a gospel that at once offered the mediation of grace and assurance of personal salvation, while at the same time calling for a just and righteous order resulting in social transformation. Social justice, empowerment, access to education, voting rights, property rights, legal rights too were a work of human redemption. Gentle concluding rhetorical questions. Which rendition of the story will best attract the admiration, commitment, and loyalty of our children and our children's children? Indeed, which rendition of the story is most capable of inspiring the parents and grandparents of our children and our children's children? Fernando and Ana are among the first to be memorialized in the La Sierra University Path of the Just, precisely for their efforts in incarnating a gospel that it once called for social redemption of an oppressed population, no less than the personal redemption of individual persons. In summary, the Stalls incarnated a vision of the gospel that mirrored the simple testimony expressed by longtime professor of ethics at Harvard Divinity School, James Luther Adams. In the course of classroom lectures, Dr. Adams would occasionally tug both sides of his vest and exude, personal ethics and social ethics are of one piece of cloth. Thank you, Dr. Adams. Now, you know how far I have strayed over time, and I'm ready for direction as to whether I should sit down now as we go to the sanctuary, or
we'll run some questions and answers. Paul, do you mind helping me run that around? And Mary, can maybe you and Joe hand these surveys out? I want you to take a look at these, please. Some came in after we started this morning. We're just asking you a few quick questions today, and we'll collect these from you. They'll help our board plan some programming in the future. Gordon, you have a question.
Charlie, is there any inkling at all that the Stalls, or Fernando at least, either one of them knew what they were getting into before they left this country, or were they surprised what they found and adapted to the situation on site?
I cannot speak definitively on that. Here is the way I have phrased it to people and the impressions I have garnered. Their first place to land was not Peru. The first place to land was across Lake Titicaca. But on the shores of Lake Titicaca in Puno, there was a man named Manuel Zeta Camacho. Manuel Zeta Camacho was way ahead of his time, and he was a Aymara indigenous person. While we don't know the circumstances, he was forced to spend a year going to a public school in the city where his uncle lived. He, speaking Spanish, was allowed to go to school. That gave him a vision underscoring the vast injustice that he had experienced on the shores of Lake Titicaca, and imbued him with a sense of visionary, in our society, evangelical aggressiveness. It has been surmised that the Stalls made initial contact with him as they passed through the Lake Titicaca area on their way to the capital of Bolivia. Camacho was a forceful protagonist. The Stalls moved back to Puno. The Stalls paid their own way, by the way, down there. Moved in with him, Camacho and his wife, with their 2 kids, in a mud brick choza with a thatched roof, mud floors, still there, we visited. Lived with him for a year, and then Camacho was part of the Stall team. When they opened the first mother's school, a mother's school which was the first of nearly 200 schools being established throughout that section of the Andes, the missionaries from the East Coast couldn't handle the altitude, principal, vice principal, had to run back home, and it was Anastal and Camacho and the father of the Chambi family. Our school has graduated the great-grandchildren of the Chambis, who ran the school and helped multiply those schools like poppy seeds over the Andes Mountains. And today, while if I were in charge, I would make sure there were 3 people in this statue. There stands a statue of Fernando Stall in the midst of the town on the shores of Lake Titicaca, and Camacho. I would have had Fernando and Ana Stall. Parentheses. I received an invitation 2 years ago to come down for the dedication of the Stall House as a museum. And it was to be called the Fernando Stall House Museum. I said, no way, Jose's. I will come down if the brass plaque reads, the Fernando and Ana Stall House. And that's something that still needs to be worked with. So, the quick answer, Camacho was the live wire that showed Stall the inequities and injustices. And that Stalls embraced wholeheartedly and ran with it. Yeah. Did they know ahead of time what they were getting into? Unlikely. But they didn't shrink. The point is, they took it over and participated also, I think I may have mentioned this, in getting a religious toleration clause in the national constitution. And how much more tied in can you be than that? Yeah.
I've got a question here. Can you comment on how much the brethren in Tacoma Park, our world headquarters, knew what was going on? And was there any kind of correspondence or any kind of, was it easier for them, not that this was easy, but was it easier for them to do this kind of social activism miles away on a different continent than it would if they were in Boston, as you had been years earlier, doing this sort of, what was the interplay between brethren who weren't too hepped on doing this themselves?
Did I mention that when Jesus returns, he returns to Boston on the Charles River? Yes, there is evidence. However, when I first arrived at the Lake Titicaca mission, intent on digging up the records, sir, we had a fire in the year XX. Those don't exist. However, there is correspondence with the General Conference that does exist. to what extent were they fully aware of the fact that Fernando, with his measured approach, Ana, with her measured approach, was allied with Camacho? I am absolutely confident there would have been an emissary sent down there to say, hey, you are consorting with folks that are considered as political radicals. But that didn't happen.
And there would have been a long session of prayer, and there would have been a backing off or a real distancing or something, huh?
Let's just put it this way. A film has been made by folks in Peru, a feature film. Do you send tapes out here? Yes, I think
Yeah,
you do.
we do. But we send them out to appreciative audience. And we have a lunch. You know what? We have a luncheon afterwards that's not taped.
Yeah,
if you
I'll
want to come
finish-
answer that question.
I'll finish.
Okay?
I'll finish
There
that
you go.
paragraph at lunch.
Yeah. You can get your plate of food, come eat at the board meeting, and if you're not able to do that, call me and ask me later what he says. And if you've got your tape recorder turned off, I'll tell you. Are there other questions that you'd like to ask this morning? We'll take one or two more before we go to worship. It's always fascinating when we have speakers to come and kind of expand our whole knowledge base. You know, so we get some in here to talk about things that we're already familiar with the topic. It's nice when we have people come in and speak about things that we really maybe hadn't even heard of. Ron?
Okay, I just would like to thank you. I'm probably one of the radicals in this group. But what I want to say is we have so many people who look back at the good old days. And I thank you for pointing out that not necessarily true. That there's a lot of things that happened. There's a lot of things that had to happen to get where we are today. So I'm one that's always going like, no, the good old days really weren't that good. A lot of changes need to take place. Thank you.
Any other question? You know, I have one if I hear crickets this morning, and that is, what would you suggest to those, and I won't name any names in the LA area and others, who see the church needing to do more social issue? What would you suggest for people and how to go about that sort of thing, either as individuals or just a cluster of people, without just wringing their hands and blaming the church because the organization doesn't do something?
Well, I'm not paid to recruit students to La Sierra. Send your grandchildren and their children's children to La Sierra. We have a great faculty, whether you're talking about business, whether you're talking about archaeology, whether you're talking about religious studies. And our enrollment keeps going up, and it's a great place to be, and I think it is a great place to not be totally sheltered from the story of Fernando and Ana Stahl, and then carry that into other disciplines and so forth. I came to La Sierra with the intent of retiring in La Sierra. And this year I cut back to 2/3 time. And I'm delighted with the privilege I have had of working with the faculty and in a context in which being religious doesn't exclude being relevant. That is a general response to your question. Thank you for your patience with me this morning, and I'm not sure I'll ever tie in with the screen business again, because I have a hard time sticking with what's in front of me, and I do like to look people in the eye rather than looking a page in the eye.
Any other questions before we? Yes, Paul? Yes.
There is, what is, how is missionary work impacted by someone like the by people like the Stalls who go to a place and basically spend their life there, as opposed to, and this is my own terminology, religious or missionary tourism, which goes and lasts a few days, and then, the reports come back about, and the analysis is basically how much we have and how much they don't have. What are some of the, the impacts of that kind of long-term, embedded missionary work as opposed to, 3 days in?
I'm going to phrase your question slightly different. I'm not sure I'm equipped to really respond to that, but this responds in part to that. I have seen the children of missionaries resulting at far ends of the spectrum. I think of one family where the father had been raised by missionary parents in Asia. The father, in turn, and mother returned after 2 or 3 decades. Their children, she was a convert to Adventism from Nova Scotia. He, raised by Adventist missionary parents, went and did a doctoral degree where he insisted he could combine New Testament studies with cultural studies. And people say, well, figure out who you are. Several universities. But the leading Southern university that accepted him pushed him. And I have taught his kids. His kids fairly exude cross-cultural awareness, appreciate it fully. One went, got a doctorate in anthropology, teaches at the University of Boulder. The other took medicine, but she's really a dancer in terms of traditional interpretive dance. I have never seen 2 more well-adjusted kids. And the anthropologist keeps going back to Asia. On the other hand is the opposite extreme. I've seen children of missionaries not able to be reintegrated in the birthplace of parents and grandparents. And I presume if I had that all figured out, I would be a consultant. I don't have a quick answer to that dimension that is part of the question you posed. I wish I did. Indeed, when the Stall's grandson went with Adra, married a bright and articulate Peruvian whose mother was a businesswoman, not in the capital, but out in the jungle fields, I couldn't help but notice that when his kids reached school age, he left Peru and came back to make sure his kids got raised in an educational context of the U.S. And I, of course, then asked myself, I know where Fernando's and Anna's son evolved. Practicing Adventist in Oregon. I don't know what happened to Franita, the daughter. I know she went to Spain, but she kind of merged into the landscape. I wonder if Fernando Saul's grandson made that movement, not wanting his kids to be detached from their roots. And that conundrum, I doubt, will ever be solved. How come some Adventist missionary kids explode in seeing the big world, and others, and I see faces right now of missionaries who'd gone to the Peru and went to the jungle where she baked a lemon meringue pie by digging a pit and making the coals be the oven. And that missionary offspring just couldn't fit back in. Yeah. Boy, I hate to leave on a less than positive, affirming note.
Well, we're not finished, because we'll go to worship, and there will be tables set up here with food on it when we return after worship, and then we'll eat lunch over in a boardroom. And those who want to continue the discussion, we obviously have a question ready over there. We'll ask you to answer.
Thank you, folks.
Yes, thank you. Let me just simply thank our board again. Of course, Jim and Gordon and Judy as well. And I think Mary Proctor Dane's here this morning, as well as Paul. And Larry does our PA stuff in the back. And there are a couple of others missing, Pastor Gary and Neil Hendrickson and Chuck McMillan. But also with us is, Maxine Nicola. And we have a new board member who's great. We've got Dwayne Sandvik back here, our treasurer. We have a new board member, Margaret Hernandez, who's joined us in the last week or two, and we appreciate her help. I think Caitlin Rasmussen's back in the kitchen. So, Margaret, if you just wave your hand, stand up. People may not have seen you, but thank you for joining us. Dr. Mary Proctor Dane in the back. There you go. Yeah, this is the person who communicated so much with you and got you down here. Thank you, Mary. Yes, the surveys, if you have those, if you could just raise your hand, we'll collect those from you. If you don't have it filled out, you can give it to me later after church. We're very interested in your input. Thank you for being here, and we'll kind of give some time to get on over to worship in the sanctuary before it starts at 11:15. Again, Dr. Teel, thank you so much for being with us today.